Welcome back, everyone. Here we are at ID24. We have an exciting presentation coming up with Ashley Bischoff, who is one of our TPG colleagues. Really exciting for this one. Her talk is on embracing plain language for better accessibility. Hopefully you've been with us for all or some of the past 24 hours, or I guess we're up to 24 hours soon. And if not, if you're just joining us, we want to let you know that we're taking questions during the talks using the hashtag ID24 on Twitter, and also to let you know that captions are available in the description of the YouTube channel. So if you need those, just check in the description section. So yeah, Ashley, I guess, oh, and I'm also here, sorry, I guess I should also introduce, sorry, Michiel, we got to show off your dinosaur a bit. He's had a wardrobe change between, so he's back in the outfit. Say hey, Michiel.
Hi, and yeah, I'm really excited to see this talk again because I saw that at CSUN, and I do hope everybody gets here on time this time, but I'm sure Ashley will handle it just fine. Was actually quite funny at CSUN, but so hope for less interruptions this time. But yeah, it's a great talk, and yeah, can't wait.
Fantastic.
Okay, so we'll put it over to you now, Ashley. All right, here we go.
That sounds good. I will share my screen, and away we'll go. Presenting screen share. All right, can everyone see my screen just to make sure that we're in good shape? Okay, fantastic. So as Johnny had mentioned, as well as Michaela, I work at the Paciello Group, and what I do there is I'm a copy editor as well as an accessibility analyst. So this is kind of a good fit within my wheelhouse. And just as a reminder, if you have questions along the way, feel free to tweet those to me if you'd like, or to either of our moderators. Just be sure to use the hashtag ID24, and that's how we'll know what your questions are. And once we've collected all of those, we'll answer as many as we can once we reach the end. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is how plain language can improve our accessibility. And for many of us who work in the field of accessibility, it's not uncommon for us to write things of reports and analysis and documentation, and that's all good things. But you know what? Our documentation and our reports and analysis are only as good as what people can get out of it. That if people find our writing to be unintelligible or too complicated, they won't be able to make use of our advice no matter how good that advice may be. So you might be wondering, okay, well, what makes some writing more complicated than others? You might be asking yourself, how do I know if my writing is complicated? Well, it turns out that people who studied language complexity have narrowed it down to two factors in particular, among a few others. And primarily, it comes down to sentence length and syllables. Now, to kind of give you a better idea of that sort of thing, I thought, hey, let's go through an example of a really bad sentence. So, for example, here's a terrible sentence from WCAG 3.1.5, which reads, readability formulas are available for at least some languages when running the spell checkers in popular software if you specify in the options of this engine that you want to have the statistics when it has finished checking your documents. Now, what the heck does that even mean? It is actually, once you think about it, not terribly hard to realize what makes this such a terrible sentence. A large part of it being its enormity. This is a 40-word sentence. Which brings us to my first piece of advice, which is that the more complex material, the shorter the sentences should be. And this is because, as you might imagine, as we read and go through sentences, the brain has to take it in chunks, put it together, put the puzzle in place. And so when you've got a sentence that's 40 words long, the brain has to ingest all 40 words potentially, sort them out, see how they're related to each other before it can derive a meaning from them. Or in the previous case, maybe just throw up its hands and your brain might have no idea what they're talking about. So when it comes to sentences, experts recommend keeping sentences to between 20 and 25 words. Some experts are more closer on the 20 side, some closer to 25, but that's the general ballpark that we're talking about. Of course, you also want variety. I mean, you should have a few 35-word sentences and some 3-word sentences. The main thing, though, is to aim for an average of around 20-some words. So, all right, let's see if this can help that terrible sentence from earlier. So just to give it a go, I cut it up into a couple of smaller pieces. And you know what? It actually turns out that it is a bit easier to understand. Because if you consider this sentence, readability formulas are often available when running the spell checker in your word processor. You can specify options to show these statistics when it's finished checking your document. So all I did there was split into some smaller sentences, and I made a couple of other tiny tweaks. But that alone makes a huge difference. But you know what? Sentence length is half the battle. Cutting syllables is the other half. Now, you can think of words as being sort of like Tetris pieces, that they cover different shapes and sizes, and yeah, okay, some of them are easier to understand than others. But what it means is that syllables are the building blocks of words. That, for example, you can think of one-syllable words like so as being kind of like a 2-block Tetris piece. And you know, if you were to get a 2-block Tetris pieces like this all day in a Tetris game, you could play forever. That wouldn't be terribly hard to deal with at all. Or to pick some others, you could think of 2-syllable words like update, like 3-block Tetris pieces. And admittedly, things start to get a bit tricky with 3-syllable words, which sort of amount to 5-block Tetris pieces. Now, for those who might not be able to see the screen, what's shown here are various permutations of Tetris pieces that are each made up of 5 blocks. And for those of you who may be familiar with the game of Tetris, these might look a little off to you, and that's because the standard Tetris game maxes out at 4-block pieces. So which is to say, these already represent a greater difficulty than what you'd commonly come across in a Tetris game. So if we move on a bit, 4-syllable words, you can think of those as being like 7-block Tetris pieces. And they're not making things any easier. Now what's shown on the screen, for example, there's a Tetris piece that looks a bit like a plus sign that's been squashed. There's one sort of a weird U-shaped angle bracket. One that actually kind of has a hole in it, like a donut. And you know what? When it comes to 5-syllable words, well, they're about as much fun as toothpaste with orange juice. They're kind of bad news. And what's shown here are various iterations of even larger Tetris pieces, one that looks sort of like a square donut, one that looks sort of like maybe a middle finger or something, and I've actually kind of just realized it's a sort of Rorschach test, so maybe I should stop there. But you might be thinking to yourself, okay, all right, Ashley, this is all well and good, but you know what? Sometimes long words might be unavoidable, you might be saying. Okay, sure. I mean, just to pick one example, there's the word accessibility, which happens to have 6 syllables. And for those of us who are in the field of accessibility, it's not inconceivable that when we write reports or analysis about accessibility, we might have to mention that. And you know what? Sometimes that's all you can do. But hey, if you think about it this way, if you were to be saddled with 1 or 2 of these in a Tetris game, 1 or 2 of these enormous pieces, yeah, you might be able to get by, sure. But having said that, the game just wouldn't be fun anymore if you were to be handed huge pieces like these over and over and over. So all that is to say that it really is the cumulative effect of your sentences. That if you have some long word that is simply unavoidable, well, maybe your piece can still work. But it's the cumulative effect of your words that really affects how easy it is to read your piece. So, okay, this is all well and good, but you might be wondering, okay, how am I supposed to cut syllables? How am I supposed to do that? Well, I thought I might go over some handy substitutions between corporate speak words, which typically have a whole lot of syllables, and some plain language equivalents, which are every bit as good, but with just a fewer syllables. And I'd also like to give a shout out to plainlanguage.gov, which has a super handy list of simple words. If you go to bit.ly/plainwords, they have a page where you'll see essentially 2 columns, the left one being a bunch of complex words, and the right one being a bunch of equivalent words that are much easier to understand. So I'm going to go over a few of them, but you know what? Just thinking ahead in the future, if you come across some weird word, you might check out their list. They've got a bunch of great ideas there. So okay, let's pick one here. Like, how about prior to? It's not uncommon to see prior to in reports or things like that. But you know what? Rather than prior to, you can actually just say before. And in doing so, that takes you from 3 syllables to 2. So, as an example there, you might be used to saying something like, start your screen reader prior to the test. But you can actually just say, start your screen reader before the test. And you can start to see how, just by making even these smaller changes, that it can make your writing just that much easier to digest. Let's try another one here. How about commence? Now, commence is really just a fancy word that means start. But by making that swap, that takes you from 2 syllables down to 1. So for instance, rather than saying something like, we will commence testing on Tuesday, you could just say, we'll start testing on Tuesday. And you can start to see how a lot of this starts to make things just that much easier to understand, because a lot of this represents how people talk in real life. So let's try another one here. How about sufficient? Now this is one that consultants love to call things sufficient. Such and such is sufficient. This such and such other thing is not sufficient. But you know what? That really just means enough. And with that swap, that takes you from 3 syllables down to 2. So you might be used to saying something like, the nav bar doesn't have sufficient contrast. But it could be simpler to say something like, the nav bar doesn't have enough contrast. And that means just the same thing, but it's just a little bit more understandable. Or maybe even a fair bit more understandable. This next one, in order to, this is actually one of my favorites because you take in order to, and you know what? Almost every time you can just swap that for 2. Now you might be thinking, how does that work, Ashley? How do you take 3 words and go down to 1 word? Well, hey, stick with me. We'll go through an example. It'll make sense. But you know what? When you make that swap, that takes you from 4 syllables, including this weird sort of donut-shaped Tetris piece, down to 1 syllable, which is sort of like a 2-block Tetris piece. Now, if you might be wondering, okay, well, how does this work in real life? Well, okay, perhaps you might come across a report that were to say something like, enable grayscale mode in order to see the page without color. But you know what? You could actually just say, enable grayscale mode to see the page without color. And that works just as well. As another instance, we got accordingly or consequently. Both of those being fairly hefty words, but you know what? They kind of mean the same thing as just so, which takes you from 4 syllables down to 1 syllable. So before you might be used to saying something like, this link isn't focusable, consequently it isn't accessible, which sounds awfully dramatic, but when you say something like, this link isn't focusable, so it isn't accessible, it communicates the same thing, but in a way that makes more sense to people. Here's another one that I enjoy going through, the following. Now, this might also seem a little unusual first, but stick with me. Once we get to the examples, I think it'll make some sense. When you come across the following, you can try just swapping it for this, which in turn takes you from 4 syllables down to 1. Now, if you're wondering how this works in real life, well, consider something like this sentence. Use the guidelines in the following table. You can actually just say, use the guidelines in this table. Now, in fairness, there may be occasions where due to plurals or singulars that you may have to tweak this a bit. So for instance, if you may have a sentence like, the widget supports the following keyboard shortcuts. But you can just swap that for, the widget supports these keyboard shortcuts. So in this case, it happened to be these instead of this, but it's the same principle. Another one you might often come across is however. And when you have however at the beginning of a sentence, you can just swap that for but, which takes you from 3 syllables down to 1. And all right, so how about an example there? Well, perhaps you might be accustomed to saying something like, that works in JAWS. However, it does not work in VoiceOver. But you can actually just say something like, that works in JAWS, but it doesn't work in VoiceOver. Now, I can imagine some of you might be thinking, but can I start a sentence with but? Yes, yes you can. There is a misconception that some have that about sentences with but it's actually perfectly fine to start a sentence with but, or and, or so. Perfectly grammatical, and they totally work. So, okay, those are some examples, but you know what? When it comes to syllables, there's one trick that makes more of a difference than any of those, and that's contractions. So you're probably generally familiar with contractions, things like does not into a contraction of doesn't, which takes you from 2 syllables to 1. Or for instance, cannot into can't, which takes you from 2 syllables to 1. And you know what? With all that being said, some people might be a bit skeptical about contractions, because some people years ago may have been taught that, oh, but Mrs. Crabtree said that contractions were no good for writing. And sure, in years past, that was a view that some held. But I would like to put out there that I don't think that's the case these days. And in fact, my fellow copy editor, Tom Freeman, he analyzed the corpus of contemporary American English to look for patterns on how contractions are used in published works today. Now, this corpus is a database of 450 million words from about the last 20 years. It includes things like newspapers, magazines, TV transcripts. And these are major sources. I'm talking things like the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a wide variety of magazines covering news, health, finance, sports. So essentially, this database represents a varied selection of words that are published today, the way that words function in published works. And Tom, he thought, all right, well, how about if I just concentrate on newspapers and magazines? And you know what he found? That, for instance, don't is used almost 8 times more often than do not. He found that can't is used almost 3 times more often than cannot. Or for instance, that doesn't is used almost 3 times more often than does not. And similarly for didn't and won't, which are both used almost 3 times more often than their contracted forms. And these are not just some high school English class papers. These are things like, as I mentioned, major newspapers, major magazines, radio stations, CBS, Fox, NPR, a wide variety of published works. And what that goes to show is that the tide has turned. And what was once avoided in some contexts is now commonplace. And you know, people who study linguistics like Wayne Danielson and Dominic LaRosa, they found out decades ago that contractions improve readability. And style guides, they've been on board the contraction train for years. For instance, the Chicago Manual of Style says that most types of writing benefit from the use of contractions. If used thoughtfully, contractions in prose sound natural and relaxed and make reading more enjoyable. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, because contractions represent how we talk. Because when we talk in real life, we use contractions. When we talk to clients, when we have client meetings, when we have client conference calls, we use contractions. And that's what people are used to hearing, and that's what people are used to using. So it's no wonder that using contractions can make text easier for people to understand and get through. But you know what? Even if some of this might not be quite convincing so far, I thought I might offer another point of view here that, okay, think back to any sci-fi robot movie and the way that the robot talked. So you got a sort of picture in your head there? Invariably, movie robots end up saying something like, "I will be glad to see them if they do not get mad," rather than, "I'll be glad to see them if they don't get mad." And they do that because screenwriters know that the easiest way to make anyone sound like a robot is to take away all their contractions. And yeah, that may sound like a cheap trick, but it works every time. So the next time you're writing up something at work, ask yourself this. Do I want to sound like an automaton? Or do I want to sound like a person? Now, with all this being said, you might be thinking, all right, well, that's all well and good, but how do I know if I'm on the right track? How can I test to see whether my writing is getting more readable as I make these adjustments? Well, here's how you can check your readability. It turns out that there are various algorithms that can go through your text and come up with a reading grade level. Typically, they're based off of the number of syllables in the words and the length of the sentences as a whole. And the number that they come up with represents the approximate educational level that someone could potentially be able to understand your text. And just as a quick caveat here, the scale is based off of the U.S. educational system, which goes from 1 through 12 for public schools, followed by university, and potentially master's degrees, and so on. So just as an example, you might have a piece of text, perhaps you run it through one of these algorithms, and it says, oh, your text has a reading grade level of 12. Now, that might essentially mean that in perfect conditions, your text could potentially be understood by someone who's graduated from grade 12. But it turns out that that's kind of a bit of a misnomer, and I'll get to that in just a moment. When it comes to testing these, I can vouch for readability-score.com, which is a free website where you can paste in some text, and the site will calculate your text's readability numbers. And just to put this out there, I have no association with this website. I don't know who runs it. I just like the website. Now, if you're looking to follow WCAG 315, which deals with reading level, you should aim for a Flesch-Kincaid reading grade level of less than 9. Flesch-Kincaid being one of the more prominent algorithms for checking on reading grade level. Now you might be thinking to yourself, okay, 9? How does that come into play? You might be thinking to yourself, well, my clients have graduated from high school, maybe they've even gone to college. Where does the 9 come from? Well, it turns out that the calculations from a Flesch-Kincaid reading grade level represent ideal conditions. So, for instance, if someone were to graduate from high school, and if they had a great night's sleep, and the sun is shining outside, and they're not hungry, and they're in a good place mentally, and they're not worried about how their football team's going to do this weekend, then yeah, they could potentially manage to read at a 12th grade reading level. But here's the thing. Real life is not an ideal condition. Chances are maybe your stupid neighbor is running their leaf blower, or maybe you got a flickering light over at the next cube, or maybe some marketing drone is on their cell phone behind you, or maybe you're worried about how your kid's going to do on your math test this weekend. And all these factors serve to tug down our equivalent reading grade levels. And studies have shown that, generally speaking, people are comfortable at a reading grade level that's typically 5 or more below their maximum education level. So you can start to see, in this case, for someone who may have graduated from high school, once you take into account the factors of real life, once you take into account that real life is not an ideal condition, you can start to see that, oh, yeah, I can see how 9 could be a good place to aim for. So, okay, with that being said, if you think back to that WCAG text from earlier, the terrible bits, I thought, all right, well, let's just give an example of how this readability score works. So I put that into readability-score.com, and oh, that does not look so good, does it? Because it turns out that the very guideline that recommends a reading grade level of at most 9 itself has a reading grade level almost 12. And this is not to razz the authors of the WCAG spec, but just to say that we've got some work to do. And that when a developer, if they were to come to you and say, you know, I couldn't quite understand this part of the spec, maybe it's not just them. Maybe it's a matter of the way that we write and the way that sometimes complicated writing can make that even the best of advice doesn't come through. So, all right, with that being said, let's recap this. So when you're aiming for writing that's more accessible and more understandable, aim for an average sentence length of 20-ish words. And try to keep an eye out for any 3- and 4-syllable words in particular. To me, 3- and 4-syllable words is where my spidey sense starts to tingle, where I start to think, oh, maybe that should be something I should check on. Maybe there's a simpler word I could put in there. That's not to say that 2-syllable words you can ignore, but indeed sometimes maybe you can swap those for a 1-syllable word. But I really start to give it some even more serious thought once they reach 3 syllables, 4 syllables, or even more. And then, of course, use contractions early and often. And as you're kind of working through this, admittedly, it takes some practice, but you will get into the swing of things. You can get better at this. And as you're doing so, double check your reading grade level and your average sentence length and things at a website like readability-score.com. Now, just to offer a quick caveat here, some of you may be familiar with that. It so happens that Word has a built-in algorithm calculator for Flesch-Kincaid reading grade levels. So you might be thinking to yourself, hey, sweet, that's great because it's built right in. Well, it turns out that Word sometimes lies. That in Word's implementation of its Flesch-Kincaid grade level calculations, its algorithm maxes out at 12 for some reason. So all that is to say that if you were to get a section of text and run it through Word's readability numbers, if Word tells you, oh, this has a readability grade level of 12, that actually means it could be 12 or 13 or 14 or 15. So that's why I didn't go over the steps on how to do that in Word, because it is far too easy to paint yourself into a corner if you solely use Word. But on the other hand, sites like readability-score, they have no artificial bounds like that. So those will give you numbers that are accurate wherever they may fall. And you know, I think that about wraps things up for what I have. I just thought I might share a few links here. If you'd like to look over any of these slides or check out any of the links that are included in this talk is online at bit.ly/plain-a11y. As well, I also mentioned that plainlanguage.gov has an awesome list of simpler words, and you can get to that at bit.ly/plainwords. And it turns out Wikipedia actually has also a pretty nice list of simpler words. And you can get to that at bit.ly/wikiplain. And then lastly, if you might like to follow me on Twitter, I gab about accessibility at handcoding. And I talk about language and editing and that sort of thing at Friendly Ashley. So with that being said, I think we can turn things back over to our faithful moderators, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Awesome. Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we should now be back to not presenting only from your screen.
Yeah, Ashley,
right?
I think you need to change your screen.
Ah,
yeah,
yes.
and now see
screen share.
A reminder.
Yeah.
There you are. Great. That was awesome.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, very, very cool. We have a couple questions. We have one from, let me pull it up here.
You do the one from Lainey. I'll do the other one.
Sure. We have one here from Lainey Feingold.
Oh yes, Lainey. I loved your talk this morning, Lainey. That was awesome.
It was awesome. It was really good, yeah. Comment for Ashley. I do simplified summaries on lflegal.com posts to meet 3.1.5. Would love feedback.
Although I'm afraid I might not have time to offer feedback in real time, I think that's actually, I love that idea. I think that's awesome. I think in particular that lawyers and legal language can be hard to understand, even perhaps by lawyers at times, and I think that goes a long way, especially for regular Joes who are just trying to figure out how to get around things. I'll definitely check that out.
Cool. So Lainey, watch out for that. That is coming down the pipe. I always really appreciate Ashley's input and her spelling correction when I'm working with her. So she's been
Thank you.
She's definitely helped me out with that. So she's awesome. Michiel, you have a question from.
Yeah, it's someone called Mike, and I'm not quite sure how to pronounce the last name. It's sort of like Pacello or something. I don't know. So
I think
some dude from New Hampshire.
Go figure.
He thinks that, or he has a question. Will plain language really make a difference in translation? So would it be easier to translate something that that is written in plain language, or would it be easier to translate the more complicated words because they have a more definite meaning?
That's actually a great question, and you brought up the idea about whether complicated words have a more definite meaning, and I think that's actually kind of a misnomer most of the time. That, to pick an example like consequently versus so, those really are pretty much the same thing, or prior to and before, those match up really well. And I think that actually Mike brings up a great point that when it comes to internationalization and translations, that plain language can help there, because it means certainly that those who are doing the translating, perhaps they may be 100% fluent in their mother tongue, but maybe 95% fluent in the language that they're translating from. So certainly from that perspective, that can help ensure that your words come through even once they're translated.
All right. Sounds good.
Fantastic.
Very cool. Let me just swing over to Twitter here one more time and see if we have anything from our listeners.
Amelia has a great comment.
Yeah, Amelia's comment. Tested the same section. The spec that recommends a 9th grade reading level is written in a 12th grade reading level.
Yep, sadly so. Granted, I only tested just an excerpt of that, so that would explain why our numbers are slightly different, but I'm not at all surprised that it ends up with an enormous reading grade level.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. Well, if there's no more questions, then I guess we can wrap it up. That was an excellent talk, Ashley. Thank you very much.
It was my pleasure.
That was an amazing way to cap off my moderating tasks here. And want to say thank you to everyone, and stick around. We have a couple more hours. We have 2 more hours, and yeah, if you get to the finish line, there's all kinds of prizes for you. I think. Am I making promises here I can't keep?
I mean, hopefully there'll be like candy corns and chocolate milkshakes. I mean, that's what the deal is, right, Mikhail?
Sure. I'll
Yeah.
bring whiskey and stroopwafels, and
Hey,
we'll figure
perfect.
the rest out.
That sounds really good.
And
So
Johnny,
yeah,
if you could, do you think we could just put it back onto my finishing slide just to make sure that people
Yeah.
had the URLs for instance, my slides and that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure.
I figure that way people
I-
can check those out.
We could set it to present to all, but yeah, I actually wanted to say that you gave this talk at CSUN, and that really helped me write better content for the authoring practice guide.
Oh, thank you.
And sometimes it is a struggle to find the best way to write something, which it is anyway. But then having to simplify it at times is even harder. But I do like to do it because I do think it's important. So yeah, I think it's a great talk, and yeah, hope everybody enjoyed.
Thank you. And I think, I mean, along those lines, that's certainly, it's one thing in a way that some even well-intentioned developers struggle with portions of the spec, but as you might imagine, someone who may have, for instance, cognitive disabilities may have even more difficulties, which to me makes this even more worthwhile. And just to put this out there, as you've mentioned, sometimes when you're kind of getting your footing with plain language, it can take a little bit to kind of get your sea legs, as it were. But just for anyone in the audience, if you ever get stuck on some word like, hey, such and such word is really complicated, but what can I use that's simpler? You can always bug me on Twitter. Feel free. I'm happy to. It is no trouble. Just tweet me, say, hey, there's this weird word, or what do you think might be a simpler way to say this? And I'd be more than happy to help you out. Because I think that every little bit helps, and together we can make a difference here.
Ashley, sorry, just to interrupt and to tack another a question here on that we just received from a tweet here. And if do you want to change your screen back to take it out of screen share? Okay, great. So we have a tweet from James Nerthen, came in about a few minutes ago. He said, either to you or Lainey, how do you suggest to get lawyers to write in plain English? I can't ask for simplified summaries on contracts. So what would your advice be to get lawyers to suggest to write in plain English?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because if you think back to some of my earlier slides where I referred to, for example, experts who recommend a sentence length of 20 to 25 words, one of those experts is a fellow named Brian Garner, who himself is not only an excellent writer, but he's also a practicing lawyer. And he has several books out, some of them that specifically address legal writing in plain language, and I can heartily recommend those. And I realize that certainly this may be something that, yeah, it could take some time to get adjusted to this, but you'll find that people who read what you've written, and if you've written it in language that they can understand, not only will they get a fuller understanding of what you're talking about, but that'll create a greater bond of trust between the writer and the reader. And in that sense, with lawyers, for instance, you can put that to your advantage, that if you get a reputation for writing contracts in languages that your clients can understand, that can itself perhaps bring in more clients who might think, oh, hey, they're the lawyer who writes things that people can actually understand. I should go have my business with them. So I think that might be one way to look at that.
Cool. We also have another question here from Amelia. Have you seen any testing on the readability of text with contractions for the deaf community?
Yes. I mean, that's an awesome question, Amelia, and I haven't specifically seen testing with all these parameters, but I would expect that you would find similar results to people who aren't deaf, in the sense that what makes contractions more readable is in part that they have fewer syllables, but also that they are what's familiar. They are how we talk in real life, how people talk to us in real life. And in that sense, whether someone may be deaf or perhaps not deaf, those factors would remain true. That, nonetheless, that would be the way that people interact with each other.
Excellent. Very cool.
Also, Johnny, it's adorable the way you keep apologizing for all this, as if I mind taking more questions, although it is very Canadian.
I'm Canadian. We just say sorry for everything. So.
No, it's actually fine. We said both said it's sorry,
I'm
which
going to
is
say
nicer.
sorry for saying sorry.
Please do it. It's great.
I mean, didn't Justin Bieber, also a Canadian, didn't he have a song called Sorry? Like, it's just...
I think you should apologize for Justin Bieber. Just...
I'm sorry.
Touche, Michael.
He's a national treasure, man. Okay.
He's a national something.
Well, he's yours now. We gave him to you, so.
All right, fair enough.
So I think that that was awesome. I think that wraps it up. And we had a couple great questions come in at the end there. So that was really awesome, Ashley. Yeah, thank you very much. And I guess we can wrap this up now and make some room for the next one. Who do we have up next? So we have
John Metz.
Mark Cajolet. Yeah, we have Mark Cajolet, and then that's with Shane and Jeanne will be moderating that. And then after that, we have John Metz. So whichever time zone you're in, please check those next 2 hours. And thank you very much to everyone who participated and everyone who came out to watch these talks. They've been amazing. And so do you guys have anything else you'd like to add before we say goodbye?
Just that I had a wonderful time giving a talk, and if anyone has any follow-up questions, perhaps things that we didn't have time to get to today, feel free to bug me on Twitter. I'd be more than happy to gab about this because I love this stuff.
Great.
Nice.
Yeah. And I'll just add to what you guys said. Thanks for everybody that watched, and hope you have a good time.
Great.
Excellent.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.
All right. Thanks very much. All right. See you soon.
Bye.